Until 1:30. So what we're going to do is actually have the panel first, very distinguished panel, to give an overview on Latin America and focus in on some other countries, maybe not too much discussion of Argentina, and have a little discussion. But then we're going to have a hard stop at 1:15 to get a quick lunch and then come back for Mr. Sturzenegger. So that's the drill. So let me briefly introduce our three panelists, and they will each speak individually for 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll, for the time available, we'll have a Q&A from up here. So we have three panelists who are highly distinguished. We have one former central banker, Jose de Gregorio, and they're all professors as well as being policy officials. So Jose is, he's a professor at the University of Chile, as well as being here at the Institute as a non-resident senior fellow, and he had been governor of the Central Bank of Chile from 2007 to 2011, and prior to that he was deputy governor. So there's a central banker from Chile. And then we have Chad Bone, the only non-central banker in today's program, but also a professor who came to Washington from Brandeis. He gave up an easy life as a tenured professor and came down to the World Bank, and he's been with the Council on Economic Advisors on international trade and related issues, international trade and economics more generally, and then he went back to the World Bank, and now he's come over sensibly to the Institute. So that's Chad Bone. I don't know if he's also simultaneously a professor someplace else. No, he's not today. But Monica DeBall, who is going to be the third speaker, I think she's a central banker in waiting, but right now she's on leave from the Catholic University in Rio de Janeiro, and she's a professor over at the School of Advanced International Studies, as well as being a non-resident but mainly seemingly resident fellow here at the Institute, and she has numerous awards, but I give her mainly the Cassandra Award because anytime there's bad news about Brazil, she tells us a day in advance, so it's always very entertaining. So that's it. I think we'll just come up seriatim, starting with Jose, and then Chad, and then Monica. And then we'll have a little panel, so thank you.
I have a presentation somewhere. They appear. Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here talking about Latin America once again. And with this change, you have to wait for the lunch. So we'll try to feed you with some ideas. Hope. What I will do is just in a brief time, it's just to talk a little bit about as a introduction for all of this discussion about what's going on in Latin America, prospect, what has happened very briefly lately, okay? And then I want to talk a little bit about the fiscal and monetary policy space in Latin America and what can be done in order to resume growth, because growth and what's the role of monetary and fiscal policy. Then, of course, this week I have to make a comment on Colombia. So I'll make a comment on Colombia, and I have done my views on Colombia, and then to finish with a small final remark. I always show this I will look up these countries, and many times I just take out Venezuela because Venezuela is a mess with the data, with not just the data. Hopefully it would be just the data. It's a big mess. So, but I take the LATAM 6 or 7. I move between, and they are roughly 90% of Latin America. Okay, so this is, and since I always lead this presentation, these are the latest data for 2015 on participation and per capita GDP, all middle class, with some dispersion and the level of GDP. Of course, Mexico and Brazil made the most of Latin America. Now, this is a view of Latin America the long term, having the GDP 100 during the crisis. Now, since when you look at data of Latin America, it is always Brazil, because it's 40%, 50% of Latin America from time to time. So I do something, I take the 6 countries, excluding Venezuela, which is very nosy now, and take a simple average. This is my commitment to do something quite simple, which is not bad. And then I do the same for Asia, because when we do Asia, it's always China. So I take the 7 very successful countries of Asia: China, India, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, South Korea, and Thailand. South Korea is not properly an emerging market, but I take those 7 countries long term, and I take the average. That's all. It's very simple. So this is not a region, it's a weird thing, but it's I think that has more economic content. And what we see is the huge growth of Asia, Latin America, very small growth, taking some, this is from year 2000, taking a little bit of speed during the commodity price boom and growing similar to Asia. Then we see the slowdown. We see a recovery very similar in Asia, Latin America, in the first couple of years after the crisis, and then we see the slowdown. And this is what bothers us. And we see a region that was growing at 4%, and now it's growing to much closer to 2%, the big countries. So this is there is no, from 2017 on, this is the forecast, the IMF forecast, which is not very different to consensus and all forecasters and Bloomberg. So it's basically, that's a forecast. On a country-by-country basis, red is before and the crisis, and then blue is after the crisis. We have strong, what I show you, strong coming out from the crisis, but then we have slowdown. We have a very sharp slowdown. Argentina and Brazil in recession, we expect a recovery. I won't make any comment about Argentina. Schwarzenegger is coming, and Monique then will talk more about Brazil, so I'll just put them in this framework. But Argentina and Brazil in recession, it is expected next year a better performance for Argentina and Brazil, still in the 2s. So for the case of Brazil, even less than 1, but and Argentina growing at about 2. And then we have the rest of the countries. Chile growing hardly at 2, Colombia also a little between 2 and 3, Mexico the same and closer to 2, and Peru is the only one that's growing close to 4. To make just one comment about Peru, which I was looking carefully at the data, and I hope the IMF agrees with me. Peru, the difference between Peru and Chile, Bolivia, and Colombia that's growing at 2 and Peru is growing at 4 is mining. Peru, this first semester, is increasing 50% the mine production, because they had, during the commodity boom, they invest in very huge projects, Las Bambas, and so they have become the 2nd largest country to produce copper in the world. So they have, the growth this year in copper value added from national accounts is about 10%. So it's 10% it's 12% of GDP. So it has a big boost to economic activity. Last year, if you look at non-mining GDP, it was mining, total mining was about 3.3, was 2.5 without mining. And this year, the difference may be about 2 percentage points, the total year. So it's about the same. It's not a big difference. And this was a result of the commodity price boom. It's interesting because Chile and Peru are very similar in many respects. The two of them had a huge investment boom during before the crisis. Then the boom stopped, and the investment boom. And Peru kept increasing production, and Chile investment was basically to maintain production. So that's what makes the difference in terms of GDP, because it's a kind of mines and the projects. So labor productivity, this has been very low. This is the data on productivity. You see at the right side the decline in the rate of growth of labor productivity, which is one of the key problems in Latin America. Okay, so now, what has happened and what has been the main, after the commodity boom, mechanism for economies to grow and to resume growth has been a significant and important exchange rate depreciation. This is January 13. January 13, 100, and then I go up to today. So what we see is a sharp depreciation at different timings, different countries, but a very sharp depreciation of all the currencies. The most significant was Colombia and Brazil, were the countries also with the most challenging inflation front. And then we had, more recently, we had an appreciation basically throughout this year, and with a lot of boosting confidence in Brazil, and this has pushed most of the currencies. And Mexico, that's more difficult to see Mexico. Wow, I always press the wrong key, but this is one. But Mexico, you see, Mexico, this is the Mexican weakening of the peso. This is going up, is weakening. So the Mexican weakening of the peso, that has, of course, caused a lot of concern, has to do, I will mention, with monetary policy. But the peso has moved more with the polls in the elections in the US, but with monetary policy in the case of Mexico. I will make, so now, the same has happened with the competitiveness and real exchange rate. However, the depreciation of the real exchange rate has not been 30, 40% that we see in the nominal, because all of them have been depreciated together. So what we see is that in the case of, with the equivalent graph, we have 40% for Colombia. Brazil in recent months, it has accumulated just 10%. It has a depreciation over time, but now it's 10%. Chile and Peru, not a big also depreciation. And Mexico, which in the multilateral exchange rate has much more weight with the US, is one that has been gaining a significant more competitiveness. What has happened, the main thing that we would expect is an adjustment in the current account. The current account have adjusted in most countries. The two countries that were, the yellow line was the forecast in the April wheel, and a year ago for Brazil. And now it's the new forecast. So you can see what the adjustment, especially for the case of Colombia and Brazil, has been bigger than expected. And this is owed to some extent to the depreciation. The case of Chile, Mexico is different. So, but this has been the two countries that have been the most focused on the adjustment. In particular, Colombia that reaches close to a 7% current account deficit before the exchange rate depreciation started. So this is, now, most of this current account adjustment, and this I think that is a topic for the next discussion, most of this current has been import compression. We just have seen more recently export picking up, but most of it has been the deceleration that has brought a decline in investment and decline of the imports of capital goods and decline in imports in general. So this has been mostly the adjustment. Now, on the policy front, this is thing that I think that's interesting, is a fiscal policy. Fiscal policy during the crisis is pre and post-crisis for Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, Peru, and the average emerging market. And the picture is quite simple. Countries were extremely Keynesian. This is the cyclically adjusted budget from the IMF. So you say that the case of Chile was very impressive. The average emerging market was also very impressive. They moved from a surplus of 1 to a -2 and something deficit. Chile, the same. There was a strong fiscal, this is the case of Peru, a strong fiscal expansion during the crisis, but there was no reversal after the crisis. So the countries were extremely Keynesian on the recession, not that much in withdrawing the fiscal expansion. And this has caused some difficulties to run fiscal policy today. I wouldn't say we are in a dramatic phase as many countries, but this is particularly important. This will talk about Argentina. I don't have net data, and it's all internal debt, but it's Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, relatively higher public debt. The only countries with a very strong public debt position, Chile and Peru. But we see exactly the same here. We see that the fiscal deficit has been widening over the years. This is total, this is with the deceleration. So now there is little space in fiscal policy. Most countries are trying to consolidate fiscal policy. In Chile, there has been some effort. There are some laws in Brazil. In Colombia, which is a country that is highly dependent on oil revenues. They are trying to cover for the 2 to 3 percentage point of GDP decline in oil revenues with the tax reform. So there is not that much space on fiscal policy. And on monetary policy, monetary policy had a large increase in inflation with the depreciation. I should shorten this, but this is all the history of inflation. Where we see Chile going up the band close to 5% inflation. Then we have the case of Brazil, going to 10, and we have the case of Colombia going to 8. All countries with the depreciation, what we would expect, there was an increase in inflation. What we see today is a reversal and a decline in inflation everywhere, declining in expected inflation and declining the rate of inflation. Today, we just saw, because there is not the figure for today, in Colombia, that last month Colombia was about 8%. This month, Colombia, the last figure is 7.1. They are coming down. The monthly figure is negative, so inflation is coming down. Expectations in Brazil, in Chile, inflation is coming down, and most of them, so monetary policy most likely will change sign. What we have here is that most countries were tightening, inflation was rising, expectations in many cases were going up, and the economies were starting this deceleration. We see the most dramatic case was the Colombian case, in where they raised interest rate as inflation was going up very sharply, but also Brazil did it before, Chile, and all countries were raising rates. Now, most likely, rates will at least will go to a neutral, and in some countries, like probably Colombia and Brazil, they will start cutting, probably Chile too. Mexico is not Peru is not very likely, and well, the country that passes me as a central banker a little bit is Mexico, because Mexico has the lowest inflation rate in history, has a very stable inflation expectations. They are growing at 2.5%. The exchange rate should help them to boost exports, and they have been hiking interest rate quite significantly. I was looking last night the data on Mexico. So this is Mexico. So here we have a monetary policy rate that has been going up at the left side, and all is at the left except the exchange rate. This is the exchange rate, and the exchange rate has been this is October data. It's for some reason for the latest data that I have. So this is the exchange rate. This is the monetary policy rate that has been hiking, and this is inflation. And inflation expected. Headline inflation has been coming down, and headline inflation is coming down. This is the target, 3%. They have been since 2 years ago, roughly, below the target. Inflation expectation, this is the most amazing country, are extremely stable and are very stable. But the target is 3, and they have this roughly 3.5 for the last many, many years that you see in Mexico. And they have this, and with low inflation, and they have been hiking. And of course, it's a kind of difficult to understand. Let me make just a couple of comments on Colombia. We'll leave this, but a couple of comments on Colombia. First, the result beyond what we would like. I think that the optimal result, if you think from the Colombian point of view, tranquility would have been 80 for the yes and 20 for the no. And they got to half and half. Now, the half and half in favor of the no could be better than a half and half in favor of the yes, because it would have been extremely divisive, the issues. There was a previous peace agreement that was, I don't want to make exact comparison, but in the mid-80s, a previous peace agreement in which was when they appeared the paramilitaries, and all the killings started there. So I think that now the big problem, in perhaps if one wants to interpret the politics of Colombia, is that instead of being a three-way negotiation, it was a two-way negotiation, the government and the FARC, and the other half was never in the talks. If you read the newspapers today, yesterday it was the first meeting between the two halves, Santos and Uribe, for the first time in 6 years. So there were negotiations, and they never sat together. So in that respect, I think that this is not a vote against peace, it's a vote against the way it was negotiated, and it was also about, and the big issue, and we leave this from the other way around in Chile, is about immunity after human rights violations and people going to Congress. So this will be, I think that from the point of view of politics, they have a chance to have a much broader agreement for peace and maybe more durable. And now from an economic point of view, it's a big loss. It's a big loss because there will be a lot of uncertainty. I don't think that the discussion about the peace dividend will make very much of a difference, because now de facto there is a lot of much more tranquility than 10 years ago in Colombia, so that won't be a big deal. But we have a government very unpopular, popularity will decline even further, and they were trying to pass a tax reform. And in the direct, and I think that the first casualty will be the tax reform. And so there will be more, perhaps, economic cost than social and political cost of the discussion. Let me just finish with some point. This is what I thought, but it's one thing that has been in the case of Latin America, and we would expect that has been a decline in confidence. Governments are extremely unpopular. All governments are extremely unpopular. And we have two countries that are going through a huge change, and this is Brazil and Argentina. And we're expecting that Venezuela will follow through at some point. And we see that in the case of Brazil, we see a big increase in business confidence after the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff. But I always say that all my friends in Latin America tell me how you did it in the early 90s. Because Chile was extremely successful in reducing inflation, consolidating the budget, and growing a lot in the first half of the 90s. And people say, well, how can you do it? And I think that it's not comparable. It's not comparable because Chile in 1990 was a sound economy. It has a decent fiscal account. It was an economy with a slow distortions, with a lot of reforms already implemented. And the case of Brazil and Argentina, they have huge distortions, so it will take them some time in order to recover. I think that they are much closer, or they are in between what was Chile in 73, which is a huge economic mess, closer to Venezuela today, perhaps, with a huge economic mess and with a very costly stabilization than what it was in the 90s. And I think that the big challenge in these countries, although I won't refer, is whether the country and all the adjustment that they are doing, how long it will take time for growth to resume, because that's key for public support and for not derailing the needed adjustment. So thanks.
So thank you for the opportunity to be here today. My name is Chad Bound. I'm a senior fellow here at Peterson. Think about this, I guess, as a trade policy sandwich, right? So we're going to have macro is in central banking is the bread on either side, and in the middle is something completely different. So the title of my talk is Latin America's Trade Policy Outlook, but it's probably a better to think about it as trade policy opportunities, because I'm not sure what the potential for these are, but there's a lot of things out there for Latin America certainly to be thinking about at this particularly transformative moment. Let's see if I can, okay. So the first slide I wanted to put up there is my only slide about actual real economic activity. The rest of it is going to be policy. And so this is trade flows. Volumes on the top, imports on the left, exports on the right, I believe, and import and export prices on the bottom. And this is monthly data. Latin America, the region is red, so I tried to pull that out. And the other regions up there are the other groupings of countries are the advanced economies, and then other groups of emerging markets, Central and Eastern Europe, Africa, Middle East, and emerging Asia, right? And what you can see from looking at the import volume data is, Latin America, the red line again, and that's the upper left panel, doesn't look that bad, and in fact is doing better than a lot of other areas. You can, I guess as a reference point, you can see the crisis there in 2008-9. In the upper right panel, when you look at their export volumes, they actually seem to be doing better than many of the other groups of countries, right? So in the topic of the trade slowdown that seems to be happening right now, and I'm not going to get into any great detail about this particular topic, but it is certainly a topic that's been out there. Where you can see this happening, I think, especially for Latin America, is in the bottom right, which is their export prices. And so to the extent that they're heavily concentrated in commodities, especially, whether we're talking about foodstuffs or copper or even some steel production by Brazil, Argentina, et cetera, falling world prices for their exports is certainly at the higher end, and that's what we're seeing there. Okay, but what I want to focus mostly today, this is going to be that's the last slide that I have on actual trade and economic activity. The rest of it is on policy, and that's what I wanted to focus on. And I'm basically going to walk us through three different sets of policies to think about. The first is essentially what is Latin America's external stance, their external level of openness vis-a-vis the rest of the world, right? So I'm going to show you at some point how integrated Latin America is in and amongst itself with other countries in the region. But there's substantial heterogeneity across Latin America with respect to just how open they are to countries that aren't in the region. The United States, Europe, Japan, China, et cetera. And I think that's going to be very important to tease out. I will get into the issue of their FTAs, their free trade agreements, and their tariff preferences, basically to show the heterogeneity that exists there also, because I think this is part of the point. And then at the end, I'm going to return to the question of what are the opportunities out there that Latin America could be participating in today in terms of new outward sets of trade negotiations that they're not currently taking advantage of, but that are actually going on and they could be part of if they chose to. All right, so this is just a chart to basically show you what average external tariffs. So this is MFN tariffs rates. This is, if you're a U.S. exporter and you want to sell your good into Brazil, this is the average tariff that you would pay. Or to Argentina, sort of have a common external trade policy under Mercosur to countries that aren't in the agreement with them. Those are the first two bars on the left. The applied tariff that you have to pay, that's the black bar. The gray bar sitting on top of that is what's referred to as their tariff overhang, right? That's the amount by which these countries could actually increase their tariff toward the rest of the world without running afoul of anything under the WTO, okay? So the first thing you note is, wow, Argentina and Brazil under Mercosur, their applied rates are relatively high, 13.5%, much higher than other comparison countries even in Latin America. Peru's at, 3%, Peru's at 3%, Colombia, Mexico, Chile's at 6%, Colombia, Mexico, 7-8% around there. Argentina and Brazil, much, much higher. Then you take into the consideration that, wow, they could actually increase their tariffs. They could more than double them, right? Their binding rates their legal commitments to the international community are in the neighborhood of 30% or so. So that allows for a lot of policy uncertainty, right? They actually haven't taken on a whole lot of legal commitments at the WTO. And on the right-hand side, this just points out. So the middle is the G20, all of which have tariffs that are much lower, with perhaps the exception of India and then Korea as well. But Korea's got a lot of free trade agreements. These are again the tariffs that are bound and applied under the WTO. Tariffs for other East Asian countries that are maybe comparisons: Philippines, Taiwan, Thailand, also typically much lower as well. Heterogeneity within countries also, yes. This I'm going to show you just a couple of countries. Brazil, you tend to see it still relatively high tariffs in manufacturing, textiles, apparel, footwear. Brazil in processed food, less obviously in animals and vegetables and agriculture. But tariffs that are still relatively high, right? So textiles and footwear, somewhere between 20 and 30%. This suggests that there is still a lot of traditional trade policy negotiations that we weren't really talking about anymore amongst the United States, Europe, tariff cutting that Brazil and other countries in Latin America could still engage in productively, right? And this is going to be important, and we'll come back to this. And as a comparison, the tariffs, for Mexico, again, this is not Mexico's tariffs under NAFTA toward the United States. This is Mexico's tariffs toward its non-FTA partners are much lower. They're still relatively high in certain sectors. There's heterogeneity there, but they're much lower than Brazil. You can't see this, but think of this as a heat map. The shaded in areas are the countries that have extensive preferences toward each other, and typically under free trade agreements, though a lot of these agreements are not 100% coverage in terms of products. And what you see is in the upper left, this is Mercosur and Bolivia, Ecuador, and those countries. A lot of preferences toward each other, but not a lot of preferences toward everybody else in Latin America, with some exceptions. There's, an FTA with Mexico, et cetera, but not toward Central America. And in the far right columns, those are potential free trade agreements, preferences with countries outside of the region: the United States, EU, Japan. And so when you look at Argentina and Brazil, none of that, right? No FTAs with the major economies that are outside of the region. As you go down the rows and you start to look at countries like Mexico, Colombia, Chile, Peru, the Pacific Alliance countries, the Central American countries, what you see is, yeah, they have a lot of FTAs with each other, fine. They have some FTAs with Argentina's and the Brazils and Mercosur and the countries on the left. But what they all have in common is FTAs with at least the United States, also the EU, and increasingly Japan, right? So you have really two different worlds, broadly speaking, in Latin America. You have those that have gone beyond the Latin American free trade agreements, but have also started to liberalize externally through FTAs with the United States, Europe, and increasingly Japan as well. Okay, so how did we end up there, right? How did we end up with countries, some groups being relatively more open to the external world through their tariffs, and some countries not, right? So which did we end up with having these sort of the building block effects versus the stumbling blocks? And this dates back to some very important work that my colleague Carolyn Freund and co-authors developed over the years. So this chart, plots three pieces of information that for countries on the left-hand side that have signed FTAs with the United States. The red square, that's what their tariff was in 1995. The circle, the non-shaded circle, is what their average tariff was, their MFN tariff toward the rest of the world was 5 years before they signed an FTA with the United States. And then the shaded circle, the black circle, is what their MFN tariff is today, or 2014, the most recent data. And what you can see is, by and large, a steady downward progression. In 1995, a lot of these countries had tariffs that were, above 10%. They reduced them a bit, basically right before signing an FTA with the United States. But then once they've signed the FTA with the United States, they've cut their tariffs not only toward the United States, but toward the rest of the world on an MFN, a non-discriminatory basis as well, right? And that's really served as this building block effect, arguably. And the countries on the right-hand side, the Argentina, the Brazil, Venezuela, Ecuador, et cetera, they haven't done that, right? Their tariffs today are essentially what they were in 1995 for the most part. They haven't done additional liberalization, relative to where they were even 20 years ago. And so we saw a lot of, in Jose's charts, a lot of movements on various policy things. On the left-hand side, what you see since 1995 is basically that story for Argentina and Brazil. Tariffs toward the rest of the world, basically flat, right? Tariffs toward each other through the Mercosur FTA, getting down to zero, but toward the rest of the world, not moving. Now, in a recent paper with a colleague in Peru, Patricia Tovar, one of my former colleagues at Brandeis, we looked at this question of, what happened in Mercosur in the 1990s. And what we argue in that paper is really, to some extent, Mercosur is not even a free trade agreement, let alone a customs union. And we do that by examining these temporary trade barrier policies of anti-dumping, safeguards, countervailing duties, import restrictions that don't show up in the general tariff data. They're separate trade policy barriers. And what you see when you look at that data is Argentina, why are they not an FTA? Argentina tends to use a lot of these sorts of import restrictions against Brazil, right? So there isn't even really internal free trade in the Mercosur bloc. And then externally, Argentina uses anti-dumping against imports of, some widget from China, and Brazil uses anti-dumping on imports of some other completely different widget from the United States or Europe. So there's a lack of a coordination vis-a-vis third countries as well, right? So if that's the case, they're not really exploiting, to the extent possible, their common external trade policy, which is what you have otherwise in a customs union. So that makes you step back and say, well, why form a customs union, right? If part of the argument is, and there are certainly a number of different arguments for why you form a customs union, one of which is to increase the market scale for which you can achieve greater economies of scale and spread out your fixed costs. Fine, there's benefits there. But one of the other arguments, and again, if we date back to what the European experience starting in the 1950s was with the European Economic Community, European Union, you take a number of relatively smaller countries, you put them together, and they form a bigger negotiating bloc against other countries, right? The United States. They haven't done that, right? Brazil and Argentina, by failing to coordinate their trade policies vis-a-vis third country, every time each one of them receives a shock, they respond independently, they don't act in concert, they aren't able to exploit that joint potential market power that they might otherwise have, right? Okay, so that's part of the story there, and there's other examples that we can go through again. So then that leads to the question: what are some of some of Latin America missing out on in today's trade negotiations that they could be more actively participating in? What is out there, the opportunities that are going on right now? Well, we already have one agreement that's potentially happened, so it's signed. We're still waiting for it to get implemented, but this does include a significant fraction of the Pacific Alliance countries, at least, Chile, Peru, and Mexico, maybe Colombia down the line. So what is this thing? Well, there are reductions in tariffs, but that's not really what this type of agreement is about. Right? This is all about new disciplines, such as government procurement, state-owned enterprises, investment, SPS, TBT, transparent, lots and lots of new rules and provisions going well beyond traditional tariffs. And these are the new issue areas that especially the United States and other high-income countries are interested in negotiating over. Most of Latin America is not yet there. What else? Well, again, this is important to point out for folks that don't follow the intricate weeds of trade policy negotiations all that closely. As Gary told us almost a year ago, Doha is dead. Right? We're not doing Doha anymore. It's gone. So if you're waiting for it to pick up again, you're going to miss the boat. What we're doing instead, the negotiators out there, they're turning to these plurilateral agreements. So the first one to get accomplished was the updating of the Information Technology Agreement, right? The first Information Technology Agreement that was signed in 1996 included eventually a number of Latin American countries, but was never signed onto by Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, right? The new one so far has very, very few Latin American countries participating, right? So where are the major economies there? Again, this is 201 new products. It's about 3% of all statistical code, so it sounds like a small number, but it's not. $1.3 trillion in trade. It's got lots of cool IT gadgets in there, video game consoles, headphones. Healthcare, cutting tariffs to zero on MRI machines, CAT scanners, pacemakers, things that might bring down healthcare costs, interest for public health officials. Lots of intermediate inputs, right? Why is that important? Well, if we go back and look at a country like Brazil's tariffs, not only does it have relatively high tariffs, here I split out the tariffs within a sector by whether these are on final goods or intermediate inputs, right? So we're used to seeing this phenomenon of tariff escalation happening for countries everywhere around the world, higher tariffs on final goods than on intermediate inputs. But that being said, you still see relatively high tariffs in these countries on intermediate inputs themselves. And that really discourages global supply chain activity from forming, right? So you still see relatively higher, not higher than final goods tariffs, but tariffs that are well above zero, well above 10%, 15% in textiles, footwear, transportation equipment, et cetera. Two last sets of negotiations that they could be participating in, and then I'll stop. There's an ongoing set of negotiations for environmental goods, right? So potentially cutting tariffs on clean energy products, solar panels, wind turbines, air pollution control measures, solid waste, wastewater treatment, right, to address environmental concerns, climate change, estimated covering roughly $1 billion in trade, just a critical mass of countries that are negotiating so far. But again, the major economies of Latin America, not there, right? Potentially missing an opportunity. And then finally, also the Trade and Services Agreement, right? This is ongoing as well. And all of these countries have needs for major service sector reform, and that could be tied to additional liberalization. Again, same sort of story. While you have, in this case, a number of additional Latin American countries that are at the table and in part of the negotiations, some of the key players like Argentina and Brazil aren't there yet. Thanks.
All right. So thank you. Good afternoon, I guess, to everybody. I'm going to talk a bit about Brazil, and I want to start by saying to Gary that I'm going to try not to be as much of a Cassandra this time. Let's see how successful I do on that note. So the question is Brazil at a turning point? And last week we had a discussion on global economic prospects by Dave Stockton, and he used a very nice image to characterize the global economy as a driverless car in a slow lane. Brazil has been a driverless car at a precipice or approaching a precipice very dangerously. And here are the numbers of the precipice. So the economy contracted by an estimated, or is expected to have contracted by an estimated 7% in 2015 and 2016. In per capita terms, that translates into a contraction of about 10%. Unemployment is up to nearly 12%. 12 million people have lost their jobs, and real incomes are falling steadily. I think we can say with a fair amount of confidence that I won't make any remarks about the driver, but there is a driver, and that driver now is approaching what looks like a slow lane for Brazil. So it does look as if we are at a turning point, and there will be a recovery. The question, of course, is how intense and how fast that recovery is likely to be. And on that, I have to be Cassandra Gary and say that it's unlikely to be very rapid or very intense, precisely for some of the reasons that Jose himself has already talked about. Brazil has a number of very, very serious structural issues. These structural issues are best illustrated, but they're not confined to fiscal issues. So back in March of 2006, the Institute produced a PIIE briefing, a policy briefing, authored by Olivier Blanchard and Adam Posen. And in one chapter of that policy briefing, I outlined what I saw as Brazil's main fiscal challenges at that time. These numbers have changed somewhat now. This is the debt to GDP ratio under various scenarios. I won't go into the scenarios, but please focus on the blue line up there, because that blue line is really where the country was heading, or in other words, the driverless car was heading to the precipice. So we had this growing debt to GDP ratio that looked unstoppable at that point. And because this was before the impeachment process, this was before the suspension of Rousseff, this was at a time when the country really had no leadership, it looked as if this problem was really only going to be solved by inflation, if it was going to be solved by anything at all. So this was the picture that we had back then. Since then, we've had a change in government. So as I said, we have a new driver driving this car. And what this government has done is announced a series of policy measures to address fiscal issues, but also to address a number of other issues. I'll focus on the fiscal, and I'll talk a bit about the others in a second. The first and most important aspect, I guess, of this policy effort is, and it's going to be voted on today, so today happens to be the day that this one particular pillar of the policy effort is going to be voted by Congress, is the introduction of an expenditure cap. So Brazil has this issue, and it's been a long-standing issue, that only 10% of the expenditures in the budget are actually under the government's control. All the remaining expenditures are actually indexed or constitutionally mandated or answer to other things that the government has absolutely no control over. So what the expenditure cap aims to do is to actually increase the ability of the government to control spending. And this increase, according to the text of the legislation of the expenditure cap, which is actually a constitutional amendment that needs to be done in Brazil, would now encompass, rather than 10% of expenditures, some 49% of expenditures. So it's quite a significant change. And hence why the Brazilian government has been very insistent that passing this particular constitutional amendment is key to changing that debt to to GDP graph that I just showed you and that debt to GDP trajectory. Now, of course, the expenditure cap as it stands still leaves out 51% of total spending, which is not covered by the ceiling. The ceiling, by the way, is a ceiling on growth of spending, and that growth on spending would be limited to the inflation of the past year, so that in real terms at some point you're not going to get any expenditure growth for 49% of the budget. But there's 51%, which is not under the ceiling. Of that, more than half of that is actually Social Security, which is why Social Security reform is the second pillar up there on this list of reforms. Social Security reform, of course, is very contentious. It's contentious anywhere. The government does want to put forth this proposal by the end of the year. We're in October. The end of the year is nigh. And hence there's a question here about, the politics of this and whether this is actually feasible. Nonetheless, for the moment, we would have coverage for 49%, but not the 51%. So this raises a question, which is a question that I have been raising and have been trying to think through, which is, would Brazil also need a debt ceiling? Is a debt ceiling something that might be able to address this loophole of 51% in spending that is currently not covered by the expenditure ceiling? So Social Security reform, as I mentioned. Then there's a plan on concessions, PPPs, and privatization that the government has announced, and a renewed focus on trade, though what that exactly means, as Chad was showing, is still up in the air. As Chad just showed us, there are a number of initiatives that Brazil is completely out of or completely isolated from. The caveats. The policies and the reform effort that I was just discussing on restoring medium-term fiscal sustainability, they're focused on the medium term. So the issue here is, how do you address that chart that I showed you from our March 2016 PIIE briefing, and thus how do you revert that situation rather than, how do you bring the economy out of this deep slump at this very moment? So that's what most of the reform effort is focused on. Of course, fiscal reform, as we know, has all these good implications in the medium term, but it can be contractionary in the short term, especially if you're going ahead with a very ambitious social security reform program, which does envisage a significant reduction in benefits. So there is an issue there. The investments, which are tied to privatizations and the concessions plan that the government is proposing, are not expected to materialize until late 2017 or early 2018, which means they won't be helpful either in the short term in terms of helping out the economy. So bottom line is, there's no immediate short-term relief and not really the prospect of a strong rebound by any stretch of the imagination. So the current projection that looks outward into the medium and long term and sort of sees, very slight growth in 2017, increasing gradually and very slowly to 2% by, say, 2020 or 2021 seems about right to me. And thereafter, it is also very difficult to see how Brazil actually grows beyond that limit, because the potential for growth in Brazil is really very limited by a number of structural issues that are not or haven't been addressed. Additional challenges that Brazil faces. State debts, for a number of reasons, have grown massively in the last few years, and this has had to do with some tax breaks that were introduced under the Rousseff administration. These tax breaks were quite massive because they were cumulative over time. When we look at the average and what they've implied for 2015, 2016, and 2017, on average, these tax breaks mean something like a loss of 2% of GDP in revenues, which is very substantial annually. Okay, so this is an annual impact on the budget. There is no discussion in Brazil at the moment about reverting these tax breaks. They've been made into law by the Rousseff government, and there's no discussion about reverting these tax breaks. This is an issue that is very politically charged in Brazil, and hence why it isn't being discussed. But for my part, I think it should be discussed, because it also has a lot to do with the state of subnational finances. Many of these tax breaks were taxes that actually went to states as revenues, and hence had a big impact. The tax breaks themselves had a very big impact on Brazilian subnational finances. And apart from that, Brazilian states over the last few years have run up huge payroll bills and massive debts that now have brought them to their knees. And the state of Rio is just an example, because the Olympics sort of brought that to the fore. But there are many other states in Brazil which are facing the same problems, and these states are asking for debt relief from the government in a situation where the government is tied up trying to implement these fiscal reforms. The second point is one that is very dear to my heart, because it's something that I have focused a lot of my time and research on, which is the role of public banks. Public banks in Brazil are very distortionary. I have a policy brief published here by the Peterson Institute that looks at the state-owned BNDES, Brazil's Public Development Bank. And effectively, one of the effects that you see from public banks in Brazil is that they create this massive distortion in financial markets, where you see the red line there, that's directed credit rates. These are subsidized rates that public banks provide credit at, and then the blue line are the market rates that prevail, and you can see the massive difference that exists between these two. And it's pretty much, the market is pretty much segmented half and half. So you have about half the banking system being public banks and lending rates being determined by these subsidized lines, and the other half being private banks and hence market determined rates. And then there's a question of what do you do about trade? This is something that's been on the government's agenda. They have been discussing Mercosur. They have been discussing regional integration. The question is, there are so many internal issues to resolve that I fear the external agenda might be sidetracked. And many of the things that Chad was discussing and pointing out may not actually get a lot of attention because of that. So finally, just a couple of points on monetary policy. Jose was mentioning this, and he specifically talked about Colombia and how fast inflation has fallen in Colombia as a result of several factors, including exchange rates and currency strengthening. This is more or less what is likely to happen in Brazil over the next 3 months. Right now, inflation is still fairly high. It's at 8.8%. Tomorrow, new inflation numbers come out. But when we look at projections going forward, it looks like inflation can fall very fast. And it looks like they can fall very fast to the end of the year. The central bank projects inflation at 7.3% by the end of 2016. That may be a little bit on the low side, but it's not unreasonable to assume that it's going to be somewhere between 7.5 and 8. And will continue falling thereafter, especially given the kind of scenario that we have for labor markets, where wages will continue to fall as a result of the labor market situation and the fact that the labor market situation will continue to be very dramatic despite whatever weak recovery the country manages to achieve. Of course, easing monetary policy or easing interest rates under these conditions is somewhat tricky, especially for a country like Brazil that's had lots of problems with monetary policy credibility. But as I said, inflation is likely to continue falling, and some of these fiscal reforms will actually get passed, in particular the expenditure ceiling. There's hope that the central bank will start an easing cycle relatively soon. As it well should, because as things stand at the moment, passive monetary policy has really led to very tight monetary conditions. So the policy rate, the central bank's policy rate has been kept at 14.25%, but inflation expectations, this is since the beginning of the year, 12-month inflation expectations have been falling steadily, as you can see from this chart, which basically means that real interest rates are rising. And they've risen to about 8.5%, which when you think about it is very massive, especially in a country that's still undergoing so many problems as Brazil is. So this is just to lay out a few of the landscape of what Brazil is looking like at this point. There's certainly room here for improvement, and this government is now intent on doing several things which will be very important in that regard. But we can't lose sight of the fact that, you know, this transition is going to be extremely difficult and very short, and the timing for it is very, very short. This government only really has 2 years to implement this very ambitious reform agenda. Come 2018, there will be new elections in Brazil. And I won't go very much into politics. I just want to say that the 2018 elections in Brazil are wide open at this point. So you could very much end up in a scenario where come 2018, there's a new government in place that decides to reverse all of these policies, especially because for the Brazilian population at large, the effects of these reforms won't be felt within the next 2 years. So let me end there. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks for 3 spectacular presentations. Is this on or not? No. No, it's not on. Well, there's the woman who's going to turn it on, I guess. It's on now. Good. Well, I'm going to take the chairman's prerogative of not asking a question, and so please ask a question. Bill Klein.
Well, thank you for these excellent presentations. I have a question about a couple of charts. Jose, I was looking at your real exchange rate picture, and I didn't see what I see when I do my real exchange rate, effective exchange rate picture for Brazil, which is this collapse of the exchange rate as you got to last year and the impeachment and so forth, and then almost the entire recovery of the real effective exchange rate since then. Those are my numbers. I think if you take anyway, so one question I have is, at least the collapse of the exchange rate offered a source of potential, dynamism in the export sector that could perhaps make up for the collapse of the commodity prices, et cetera. Query, is this, impeachment recovery of the exchange rate, too much of a good thing, and maybe lightening up on the monetary tightness could help make sure that that is eased a bit and that you still get some exchange rate stimulus. By the way, the other really dramatic thing that's happened in the last year is about an 18% is what I'd put it as a decline in the Mexican peso from the Trump effect. That basically it's off 14% in real effective terms. Other EMEs are up of 4% or so. So Trump has hit Mexico worth about 18%. So one could ask the same kind of story. Well, if he's not elected, then is that going to rebound, and how does that factor into the external sector? And my question on Monica's chart, I can't really understand how the private sector could pay 50% interest rates if they don't get BND excess. But boy, they must be pretty profitable if they can pay those interest rates. Is that really what that rate was?
Okay, Jose first and then Monica.
Yeah, regarding the real exchange rate, there was a huge collapse in Brazil, and then there has been a reversion. I would like to compare two data. These are BIS data, and I the same as the IFS, roughly, so there's very little difference. Now, regarding the case of Brazil, is one of the cases in which there has been some. Let's get agreement. Going up is a depreciation. Well, that may be the problem. Yeah, I look the Latin way. Going up is a depreciation, and what you call recovery is, because recovery has some sense of normality. So I don't know. So the up is a depreciation, and all countries had a sharp depreciation from 2013, and Brazil very sharp, nominal 100%, and in real terms 30-40%, and it has reverted this year. It has appreciated this year. Now, of course, all this it has had some effect on export, and we saw from Chad, but it has still, in a context of very low growth and low overall export growth, and that's why the adjustment has come through imports. Now, I agree with you that that there is a lot of the Trump effect in the Mexican peso. Now, that leads me to another puzzle. Well, there are two issues. First is what will happen after the elections, and nobody knows. Because the only lesson from the Colombian case is that those that are winning in the polls do not win in the actual election. So it's quite very uncertain what's going on. But but then it leads me to another puzzle. Why should monetary policy look at something that is so contaminated with the political volatility? So it's, I don't know.
Monica?
So let me make just one quick remark on exchange rates in manufacturing or exchange rates in export. We actually did see a rebound, very slight one, but some rebound in Brazilian manufacturing and export manufacturing in particular when we were going through the currency weakening phase. So, you know, the pre-impeachment, but while there was still a lot of uncertainty about whether or not the impeachment was actually going to happen. Since then, the strengthening of the currency, as you rightly observe, has actually led to a reversal of that. So we have already seen, again, you know, manufacturing contracting once again, or at least giving up the gains that it had while, you know, we were having that bout of currency weakening. So yeah, this is very much a concern, and I think at this point the post-impeachment exchange rate rally has indeed been too much of a good thing. And this is why I think the balance between exchange rate monetary policy and where things are in Brazil right now is just wrong. So easing really needs to start fast, and I hope the central bank moves fast on easing because things are off. They're completely unbalanced. On private sector rates, yes, that is what the private sector pays. Believe it. It's been that way for years. They have creeped up recently, as that chart showed. What's been happening in Brazil, actually, for some time, is that because as companies have run up more debt, those that only borrow locally and thus borrow at those astronomically high interest rates, what has happened to them throughout the recession is that many of these companies have, in order to remain current on their debt, because on their debt service obligations because of these high rates, they have gone into tax arrears. So the fact that you have all of these distortions in the financial sector in Brazil actually has some very bad fiscal implications, because one of the things that's happened over the last year, and it's been observed over the last year, is that the last 12 months at least, is that every time you look at monthly outturns for revenues in Brazil, they continuously surprise on the negative side. So, you know, the reason for it is exactly what I said. I mean, you have these very high rates, you have these very high levels of debt service payments, and companies just preferring to keep current on that and running very high tax arrears. So resolving these distortions, which is really not obvious how you do it, given that, as you also observe, if you have no BNDES, what happens to long-term credit in Brazil? It goes down to zero, basically. So you can't have that situation. But how do you transition from where we are now, which is this level of inordinate distortion, to something that is more normal, because this is completely abnormal when you look across the board and across the emerging market spectrum.
Our Master of Ceremonies has come, Adam, and so I'm going to ask you, Adam, whether we've got a couple of people who like to ask questions, whether people could go quietly and get their lunch, or whether you want to
Sure,
just
why
stop
don't
at
we
this
do
point.
that? It's a good suggestion, Gary. If people are willing to not be too energetic at hitting the food line, we can continue the questioning while lunch happens. Just a reminder that in 15 minutes, Federico Sturzenegger from the Central Bank of Argentina will be joining us to give a additional point of view on Latin America. But thank you, Gary. So somebody be brave and get lunch, or I'll do it. But who's next for the question? Gary's in charge.
I think Aloysio was next, and then the gentleman back there. So,
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I have questions for Chad and for Monica. For Chad, on the graphs of tariffs, I would assume you use trade-weighted averages there?
So those are just simple averages across countries. So they're the six-digit products, and just thinking about the MFN rates.
Okay, so just nominal
Yeah.
average. Okay. I just wanted to comment that intra-Mercosur trade, especially in the agricultural area, that's data many people don't talk about and don't know about. It's zero, the applied, and that doesn't show much there, and the importance of Argentina's and Brazil's trade and vice versa. Yes, there is a lot, as you mentioned, use of anti-dumping. There's not much coordination between the two. I don't know if this should exist, and if you want to develop on that in a customs union, I don't know if that should exist. I wonder, based on what the priorities are for each country and their own products, if they're all the same, then I would assume that in those cases, for trade remedies will be the same. But if not, I would assume not necessarily. And I don't think that would be an abnormal thing to happen. I just want you to comment on that, if you could. And Kiss and Monica, with regards to public banks, would you assume when you say that they're distortive, I can understand your argument, especially with regard to interest rates, but as we know in Brazil, they're the only resource for long-term lending. And the question is, now if we get rid of them, would the market take care of that? And if that happens, would it be at the 40% level or at a more palatable level? If you could comment on that also. Thank you.
Thank you.
let me ask this other gentleman to ask his question, because I think at that point we'll probably have to wrap up. So,
Hi. Thank you, Gary. It's Arturo Porsekanski from American University. Looking at the likelihood of trade policy developments in Latin America, the way I see it, see if you agree or disagree, if in the next 2-3 years, the U.S. and Europe are basically closed for business, then I think the options are as follows for Latin America. One, for the Pacific Alliance countries to either do nothing much or really to focus on themselves and deepen the agreement into the kind of common market with free movement of labor and capital and so on that they had hoped to reach. And for the non-Pacific Alliance countries, the options, it seems to me, are three. One is to do nothing. The other is to join the Pacific Alliance, which may be the only thing really going anywhere. And the third thing is unilateral disarmament. And there's certainly countries like Argentina and Brazil which unilaterally arm themselves. So maybe the best thing is for them to just undo all the damage that has been done to trade liberalization unilaterally. What do you think?
Monica, why don't you go first, and then Chad has a couple of trade questions.
Okay. So, Aloysio, on your question on capital markets, BNDES, where would the interest rate end up? I think that's one key thing that hasn't been properly thought out. I mean, there have been a number of proposals out there of how you actually make subsidized rates closer to market rates and how you could link them over time. I've been one proponent of that you could actually, gradually link what we call the long-term interest rate, which is not market set but determined by the Monetary Council, to the policy rate, and how you could do that over time and do it gradually. But you're absolutely right that once you start retrenching, it's kind of a chicken and egg problem what we have in Brazil, because BNDES has become so big that it's become the only game in town for a lot of people and for a lot of companies. But that's hugely damaging to the system. So you have to do something to BNDES. But as soon as you do something, that will mean that a lot of long-term credit is going to disappear. Finding that middle ground when you're in this kind of, corner solution scenario is a challenge and is very, very difficult. And it's something that we should be moving the discussion towards. One way to think about it is more or less what the current government is currently doing. Focus BNDES on infrastructure, take everything else out of BNDES, and hope for the best. In other words, hope that, at some point that will induce some kind of spontaneous markets to develop. And as you do that, you would use, for the infrastructure side, introduce long-term infrastructure bonds and that kind of thing, which could actually start generating some impetus for the formation of long-term credit markets. The problem, again, and where, this whole line of thinking sort of hits the wall, is when you think about Brazil's very high level of interest rates. Because at the end of the day, who's going to be interested in infrastructure bonds if you can get a short-term, any short-term bill earning 14.25% interest plus a little bit? So there's a big Gordian knot here that needs to be resolved, and it hasn't yet been properly thought out. That's, I guess, the best answer I can give you at this point. But rest assured that it's certainly an issue that interests many people, including myself, and that some of us are actively thinking about these things. On just one quick comment on Arturo's question, I completely agree with you. I think there's a disarmament problem that needs to take place. And I think both countries, Argentina and Brazil, are moving towards disarmament. The question is, how much progress can these two make given the internal problems that they're facing?
Chad?
And I'll just be quick. I don't have much to say on the internal politics of it, but what I can say is, as an economist, when we think about free trade agreements and free trade areas and customs unions, we sort of take countries at their word. And so when you actually look into the details of policies and you find that it's far from the case that they're actually coordinating and applying zero tariffs on imports from each other and then coordinating their external trade policy, it can help us understand why some of the benefits that were projected perhaps to materialize under these agreements haven't actually done so. And I think this potentially speaks to, if they're not even actually able to cooperate on very simple things like their external trade policy, getting cooperation on even deeper issues, right? And the deeper issues that are coming up in the new sorts of trade agreements and regulation and product safety standards and health safety standards. It doesn't bode well, I guess is what I would say. So I think this helps to shed light a little bit on the lack of cooperation that we're seeing between these countries, and that either speaks for the need for them to step back and reassess and figure out institutionally how they need to cooperate better, or perhaps even more, take an even bigger step back and reassess whether going down this path was really worthwhile, or whether they might want to choose some separate arrangement.
Let me wrap up with a final question for Monica and Jose. Dave Stockton and his friends at the Fed, together with our lethargic economy, have given us tremendous asset prices here in the U.S., a great stock market, good housing values. So I'm wondering, Monica, whether Brazil, with this lethargic real outlook, but your wish list on the monetary side, could do the same, even though the Brazilian stock market's already risen 50% this last year. Maybe it's got another 50 or 100% to go. And then I'd ask Jose, since Chile went through these storms quite a while ago, whether there has been or the big asset inflation in Chile. And then we'll all get our lunch.
Okay. Well, there's certainly been this, as you pointed out, this massive market rally on the back of, prospects, impeachment prospects, government change prospects, and so on and so forth. Certainly, some of it has been exaggerated, and perhaps there will be some correction once, we have an equilibrium, which I think we're not there yet, given what I said about monetary conditions, exchange rates, and also asset prices. I think things are somewhat off in Brazil at the moment. But I do see, just to give the positive note, I do see, given that the fiscal effort is taking place and given that the fiscal reforms are likely to go through, there is a chance that that equilibrium will be found and that, asset price inflation, which currently is a bit of a problem, I'd say, will actually subside.
Yeah, I don't know, I'm very humble regarding asset prices. I always miss it. So I wouldn't say that too high or too low, or is there a problem. One thing, just two reflections on asset prices. The first is that most of the changes in asset prices around the world and in emerging market has been affected by changes in currencies rather than in domestic price. So we have to look a little bit at the currency adjustment. So when you have a year with a very strong real and most of Latin economies, you of course have a very good stock market. There may be a little bit overpriced, but just look at the good side of this. They may be overpriced, so they are not cheap, and that prevents also the capital flows. That is, of course, the capital inflows. That, of course, is a challenge that in a world of low interest rate and low returns may face most emerging markets.
Thanks very much for this terrific panel.